All right, good morning. This is the Sam Sorbo Show. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're joining me on mojo50.com, welcome and thank you. And if you're joining me on YouTube, welcome and thank you. I hope you guys have noticed I'm going to a little bit of a different format, so I'm going to get into that. I also have a couple of great guests for you on the show today, so I'm excited about that. Part of the format shift is that for YouTube, I've shifted already actually to releasing a segment every other day, shorter segments, so it's not the full hour. And I know that some of you have been confused because we kind of just decided to try it, and it got a little bit. Well, it got a little confusing, certainly, because I didn't have the breaks and stuff that I needed to have. All right, I'm just adjusting my camera a little bit, and my guest is getting situated for us as well. There we go. That's better. So from now on, the show is on YouTube every other day in shorter segments. And then also I'm bringing guests in, and part of the interview I've decided to put behind a paywall because I want to form a community of people who can discuss truth and have fun and not be censored. And in order to facilitate that, I'm going over to locals.com. So you'll be able to find us at sorbos@locals.com. And I would encourage you to come over there and become a member of our community, join the community, as they say over there. But by all means, subscribe here on YouTube if this is where you're watching it, because I do want to grow my subscription base to the point where they will cancel me. That's my goal, is to grow it big enough to be canceled. All right. So let's see, I got to figure out now how to change the view to allow you. There we go. And there's my guest. So Stephen Sukup, is it Sukup?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Stephen Sukup has written a book called The Woke Supremacy. No, sorry. The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. My bad. That's a different book. He is a senior commentator, a vice president, and the publisher of The Political Forum, which is an independent research tank that delivers research and consulting services to the institutional investment community. So he's a techie guy who has investment knowledge, and he's written this book to talk about this idea that we have large corporations who are now dictating to us how we must behave. And so I brought him on because this is the fascinating paradigm. We're seeing an enormous paradigm shift, and the idea of political correctness, which I call fascism, is sort of fascism of it's just fascism, plain and simple, really, has now captured big business. And so without further ado, Stephen, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Sam. I appreciate it.
So why don't we just start at the beginning? Why did you write this book? What's the big idea here?
Well, I've worked in financial services for 25 years, which means that I've spent my entire professional career looking at and helping clients understand the nexus of politics and Wall Street. Over the past decade or so, I have seen a pretty dramatic shift on Wall Street to the political left. And over the past couple of years, more specifically, I've seen that shift grow much more dramatic and much more serious. In conversations with others in the business or who monitor the business, I learned just how deeply and pervasively this alternative moral scheme and this alternative understanding of what business function should be, how deeply and pervasively it has infested American financial services. And I thought it was probably something that the rest of the world should know about, and specifically the rest of the financial services world should know about, because it affects us directly, and it affects our business function, and then it affects the entire country, affects the entire business community.
Right. I mean, it's and it's pervasive at this point. But I think that what I'm seeing on the right is that people are saying, what I've heard people say is that these guys, they're not necessarily leftists. They're just being bullied by the left into sort of submission. But it sounded like you were saying, no, they've actually skewed left now. And so they believe the wokeness ideal.
Well, certainly there are some who are being bullied. In fact, I would divide American big business into three categories at this point. There are some who are very much believers in the cultural left and its mission. There are some who see that embracing the cultural left and its mission at this point is very lucrative, and so they've decided to jump on the bandwagon. And then there are some who are scared to death, scared of their employers, or pardon me, scared of their employees, scared of activists, and scared of activist shareholders and asset managers.
So I've often said, the people who are sort of in the middle, not committed one way or the other, but are sort of going along, are basically just as bad as the people who are pushing the cart, right? Because all they're doing is walking beside the cart as the people who push the cart push it over the ledge. So what I want to know now is what impact this shift is having on our economy and our culture.
Well, I can't say what effect it's had on the economy yet. I imagine that over time we will definitely see an impact, particularly if we allow this to go on long enough for the markets to sniff out the misallocation of capital that a lot of this amounts to. As far as how it's affecting the country specifically, I think we see in Georgia, in South Dakota, in a handful of other places, just how terribly anti-democratic and terribly top-down and terribly anti-voter much of big business has become. The belief that they should have a say in the way legislation is created, the way legislation is enacted, is absolutely ludicrous. The fact that they have decided that they are able to veto the will of the people is a very serious and a very dangerous proposition.
Wow. Who's doing it? Who's behind? I mean, I like BLM, right? But there are other players, right?
Oh yeah, there are a lot of other players, and that's a big part of the problem. In my book, I specifically look at those who are affecting financial services, and the number and impact of the people who are doing this is quite significant. It's been probably 15, 20 years that the left has been pushing financial services to pressure corporations to move to the left. Over the past 2 years, the large asset management firms, including BlackRock, which is the largest asset management firm in the world with almost $9 trillion in assets, has pushed very heavily for corporations to move towards sustainability and diversity, and has made that an investment principle.
And that's BlackRock, you're saying?
Yes, BlackRock, which is run by Larry Fink, the CEO, has about $9 trillion in assets under management. If you combine that with Vanguard and State Street, which are the other big two passive asset management firms, put them together, they control about $20 trillion in assets, which amounts to about 18 to 28% of every single company on the S&P 500. And all three of these companies have advocated very strongly for corporations to focus on A, sustainability, and B, diversity. So they're pushing a political agenda on all of these companies and wielding an enormous amount of power that is given to them by their by the assets that they manage, which
right, the money,
ironically enough is our money.
Right. So yeah, always, follow the money. But they're pushing sustainability and diversity at the cost of efficiency, right?
Well, yes, they don't see it that way, or at least they don't They claim not to see it that way, but that will definitely be the long-term impact of it.
You know, the funny thing is that people tend to sort of shrug this off and go, that's ridiculous because obviously they're in business, so they want the business to succeed. But that's not necessarily the case.
Well, the problem right now is that we're dealing with a rather arrogant class of financial leaders, people who believe that they can do no wrong and that they alone understand how to do good and to do well at the same time. So I think the problem is that we're dealing with people who simply don't believe that they have to sacrifice one for the other, that they can have their cake and eat it too.
So are they eventually just going to, I think that, I guess that the problem that we're seeing now is, and it's similar to when government regulates business. It's like self-imposed regulations that limit the efficiency and the efficacy of the business. But if everybody is doing it, then the comparison, then we lose the competitive, the edge of competition that increases efficiency and makes the businesses better, right? And
Yeah,
so if
well,
it's being implemented in a sense across the board, I mean, BlackRock Capital, and I'm sure they're not the only ones, right? And they control so much of what we have as business today, that it pressures other ones to implement the same inefficient ways. Here's the thing. If the reason that you hire somebody is a superficial reason, you're not hiring the best candidate for the job, right?
yeah, that's absolutely correct.
So BlackRock that controls, you said basically between 18 and 20%, in a manner of speaking, they control 18 and 20% of the S&P, because if that's the sort of the averaged control area, it's absurd, right? It's so much. They're influencing the way business is done in the United States. And the influence is not for efficiency and efficacy. The influence is for something superficial, sustainability, which, by the way, sustainability, okay, you know what? Let's take a step back and define sustainability for me.
Well, sustainability, the way that they use the term is essentially code for preparing for climate change. When BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard demand sustainability from the corporations that they hold, what they are doing is demanding that they are preparing for and documenting how they are preparing for a net zero carbon future. So they're essentially compelling companies to embrace the left consensus on climate change and to prepare for it in their business plans for the next 5, 10, 20 years.
And by preparation, you mean making changes making changes to feed a narrative that may or may not be efficient or effective for business, and likely do nothing to improve the business model or the profit margin of the business either. In fact, as I recall, Gina McCarthy, who was the head of the EPA several years ago, put through, for instance, regulations on carbon emissions on US businesses. And they were unfounded in science. They just put them through and said, these are the new emission standards that we are going to impose by a date certain. And it was a few years down the road to give the businesses time to make all of the changes that they would need to make to comply with these new regulations. The regulations were brought before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court knocked them down because they were unfounded, they basically crossed the line, and so they were illegal. You're not allowed to regulate businesses in that manner, whatever it was. And her comment after that was, because the questioner, the interviewer, asked her and said, you put these regulations in, but the Supreme Court knocked them down, meaning that they're unconstitutional. So, what's your reaction to that? And she said, well, it doesn't really matter because the business has made all the changes because they and during the time that they've already made all those changes. It's so striking to me that we're cutting off our toes to spite our feet.
Yeah, well, there's definitely an aspect of that. There's also the simple fact of the matter is that the markets have already priced a lot of this effort and a lot of what will be required to produce energy and to remain viable. They've already priced that into the markets. By coming along and adding this as an external force, an external demand, the likes of BlackRock are essentially requiring compliance. They're requiring that all of these companies put together a department to manage and to disclose what they've done every year, because they don't need, in fact, to be forced to do this. This is something that's priced into the markets already. So all they're doing is adding a regulatory burden to these corporations, and they're adding a regulatory burden that has absolutely nothing to do with government. This is a quasi governmental or a post-governmental regulatory scheme that's being imposed on these businesses, and thus on their profitability, and thus on their shareholders and their customers, by a few asset managers who simply believe that this is important. So they're essentially taking on a quasi-governmental role.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick break here. My guest is Stephen Sukup, and the book is called The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. We're going to continue the discussion on locals.com. So you can join us at sorbos.locals.com for the other half of this interview, where we're going to talk about the ESG movement and the ramifications of this on the individual, the investors, you guys. So give me just a minute. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back with my guest on locals.com.